Hello, everyone. Imagine you are riding the morning commuter train, mindlessly scrolling through an algorithmic feed that serves you everything from highly targeted advertisements to politically charged news clips and AI generated artwork. In that seemingly mundane moment, you are actively participating in a profoundly complex philosophical web. To truly understand this web, we must turn to the brilliant insights collected in The Philosophy of Imagination, Technology, Art, and Ethics, edited by Galit Wellner, Geoffrey Dierckxsens, and Marco Arienti. Their work forms the foundation of our entire discussion today, revealing that human imagination is no longer just a private daydream occurring inside your head. Rather, imagination has evolved into a distributed, co-shaped architecture that fundamentally mediates our relationship with technology, society, and aesthetics. We can visualize this architecture as having three distinct but deeply interconnected wings. First, the aesthetic wing deals with metaphorical semantics and the image family, how we construct meaning through visual and linguistic symbols. Second, the digital wing introduces algorithmic layers and the post-phenomenological reality, where machines and code actively participate in our cognitive processes. Finally, the social wing examines the societal implications, such as how systemic biases and pandemic blame narratives are collectively imagined and enforced. But here's the thing, we cannot treat these three wings in isolation. The smartphone in your hand on that commuter train is simultaneously an aesthetic medium, a digital algorithmic tool, and a social enforcer. It shapes what you can imagine, while your imaginative inputs, in turn, shape its data structures. This brings us to a radical realization. Our modern imagination is an outsourced, collaborative enterprise. The boundaries between the human mind, the societal narrative, and the technological tool have permanently blurred, establishing a new baseline for how we perceive reality itself. When we try to dissect the mechanics of this distributed imagination, we immediately encounter a historical schism in academia. For decades, the study of the mind has been fractured by severe methodological divides, primarily between the analytic philosophy of mind and continental phenomenology. But if we look closely at the underlying architecture, we find a remarkable convergence. Both of these major philosophical traditions ultimately agree that imagination is the active simulation of absence that constitutes our everyday meaning. Let us consider the analytic tradition, spearheaded by figures like Gilbert Ryle, alongside modern cognitive theorists such as Sean Nichols and Stephen Stich. They approach imagination through the lens of propositional logic and behavioral simulation. For them, imagination is about simulating scenarios and heedful acting in the physical world. It is a pragmatic problem-solving mechanism. Contrast this with the continental phenomenologists guided by the foundational works of Edmund Husserl and Jean-Paul Sartre. Their core mechanics focus on the concept of quasi-perception, the profound ability to make the absent present through the autonomous freedom of consciousness. Sartre, in particular, fiercely opposed the Cartesian theater myth, the outdated idea that imagination is just looking at a private painting inside your brain. Actually, if you think about preparing for a high stakes job interview, you are bridging this exact divide. You sit in your living room, projecting an absent future into the present moment, exercising the autonomous freedom of your consciousness, just as the phenomenologists describe. Simultaneously, you are heedfully simulating logical scenarios and practicing your physical responses, embodying the analytic perspective. The philosophical labels might differ, but the fundamental truth remains the same. Imagination is the active, muscular process of summoning what is not there to navigate what is. To appreciate where we are going, we must briefly map where we have been. Historical philosophy categorizes the evolution of imagination across five distinct paradigms, tracking how our understanding has matured from passive mimicry to active mediation. We begin with the empiricist view, championed by thinkers like Plato and David Hume. In this early paradigm, imagination is merely a depleted perception, a faded imitation or weak copy of a real sensory experience. Next, we encounter the rationalist and transcendental approaches of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. They elevated imagination to a mediatory synthesis, the crucial cognitive glue that synthesizes raw, chaotic sensory data into coherent, understandable concepts. The third paradigm is the phenomenological model, primarily driven by Edmund Husserl, who recognized imagination not as a servant to perception, but as an autonomous, free mental act capable of suspending reality entirely. Fourth, the psychoanalytic tradition, shaped by Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, reframed imagination as a compensatory mechanism. Here, it operates to satisfy a fundamental lack, manifesting our deepest unconscious desires through dreams and projections. Finally, we arrive at the fifth and most contemporary paradigm, the post-phenomenological view, pioneered by philosophers like Don Ihde. This is where the concept fundamentally shifts. Postphenomenology argues that technology acts as an active co-shaper of our imaginative capacity. Think of an astronomer using a deep space telescope, or a teenager using an augmented reality app. The tool does not merely execute a human command, it actively expands the user's imaginative horizon, revealing possibilities that the naked mind could never construct alone. Tools and instruments are not passive objects, they are vital, structural participants in the evolution of our conscious thought. This post-phenomenological shift leads us directly into the realm of artificial intelligence. A common misconception in modern media is the idea that an AI, such as a neural network generating digital art, is acting autonomously. The reality is far more intricate. AI does not imagine in isolation. Rather, what we are witnessing is a distributed, multi-layered faculty of imagination that is co-shaped between human beings and computational agents. We can deconstruct this collaborative process using the architectural layer diagram. At the foundational base, we have the human layer. This involves the critical initiating actions, kicking off the project, allocating financial and computational resources, selecting the underlying mathematical formulas, and most importantly, curating the training data. The human biases and intentions are baked in from the very start. Above this sits the machine layer. Here, the algorithm performs data synthesis, applying a digital schematism. Think of tools like Google's Sketch RNN or the complex generative pattern deviations executed by GAN or generative adversarial network architectures. The machine handles the heavy lifting of statistical probability, exploring millions of combinatorial pathways in seconds. Finally, we reach the top, the mixed layer. This is the interactive threshold where meaning extraction and the final value assignment take place. A human looks at the machine's output, curates it, interprets it, and gives it cultural significance. But here's the thing, neither the human nor the machine is solely responsible for the final imaginative product. Just as a modern architect relies entirely on CAD software to conceptualize a skyscraper, the modern creative process requires this entangled, distributed layering. The algorithm is not replacing human imagination, it is serving as a high powered synthetic extension of it. As these distributed technologies permeate our daily routines, they begin to construct what we might call imagination, a sociotechnical subconscious. Digital technologies do not merely present us with neutral information. They actively enforce a symbolic data worldview that dictates our digital habitus. In sociological terms, this acts as a pervasive ideology that subtly standardizes human desire. Let us look at the feedback loop diagram to see how this unfolds in real time. It starts with individual action. You log on to a streaming platform, click a video, or interact with a social media post. Immediately, this action is ingested by the system, leading to algorithmic classification. The machine categorizes your behavior, comparing it against millions of other users to predict what you will want next. This classification then projects a customized social worldview back onto your screen, effectively curating the reality you perceive. Over time, this loop generates a profound ideological lock-in. Digital tools subtly homogenize our collective imagination under the guise of convenience and personalized utility. By constantly feeding us what the algorithm predicts we want, we become trapped in predictive patterns. slowly losing the capacity to imagine wildly outside the boundaries set by the code. We see a merging of human habitus and algorithmic structures, where our very tastes, political leanings, and consumer desires are gently steered by the underlying architecture. Actually, if you look closer at your own daily digital consumption, you will realize how much of your spontaneous curiosity has been replaced by optimized recommendations. We are outsourcing our subconscious to the machine, allowing a social technical framework to define the horizons of our cultural and personal imagination. While this algorithmic locking presents a clear danger, our entanglement with technology also offers extraordinary potential. By consciously embracing our essential hybridity with technology, we unlock a new scale of cognitive power, allowing us to imaginatively confront grand challenges like global climate change through responsible techno-activism. To grasp this, we must balance two critical inputs. Input A acknowledges our human biological and cognitive limitations. On our own, our brains are evolved to handle immediate, localized threats. We simply cannot cognitively process the vast, invisible, slow moving catastrophe of global warming. It is too massive, too abstract. Input B represents technological acceleration and extension. We possess global satellite networks, deep sea sensors, and supercomputers capable of modeling complex meteorological data over centuries. When we fuse these two together, we achieve sublime hybridity. This is an emergent state of consciousness that allows us to cope with the profound disorientation and maelstrom of the Techno-Anthropocene, the geological epoch defined by human and technological impact. The concept of the sublime traditionally refers to the feeling of awe and terror when facing the overwhelming power of nature. Today, that sublime terror is directed at the vastness of our own technological and ecological entanglements. But by utilizing hybrid imagination, we translate this awe into actionable strategies. We use data visualizations to make the invisible carbon footprint visible, rallying communities and driving policy changes. This is the essence of responsible techno-activism. We are not rejecting technology to save nature. Rather, we are utilizing our sublime hybridity, weaponizing our distributed imagination to engineer systemic, planetary scale solutions that our biological minds could never orchestrate alone. This power of the social imaginary, however, is a double-edged sword. Just as it can mobilize us to fight climate change, the social imaginary can also function as a deeply ingrained ideology, actively producing and sustaining collective ignorance to uphold systemic oppression. A prime example of this is the phenomenon of white ignorance and systemic denial. It begins with shared representational backgrounds. These are the societal defaults, our standardized education systems, historical textbooks, and dominant cultural norms. When these backgrounds selectively erase the histories of marginalized groups, they directly shape our affective responses, what we intuitively feel, or crucially, fail to feel, as well as our cognitive habits. We are taught to look away, to rationalize inequality as a natural state of affairs rather than a constructed hierarchy. Together, these shared backgrounds, blunted emotions, and rigid cognitive habits build an impenetrable structure, the wall of denial. This wall is not built of mere passive unawareness. It is an active, aggressive mechanism. It actively deflects counter-narratives of racial justice and sustains self-reinforcing systemic ignorance. Think about how certain systemic biases in housing policies or loan approvals are often brushed off as mere economic coincidences rather than historic, targeted injustices. The people benefiting from these systems are shielded by the social imaginary, effectively trapped behind the wall of denial. Ignorance, in this context, is not a lack of knowledge. It is a highly curated, structurally enforced epistemological choice. To dismantle systemic oppression, we must first recognize that our collective imagination has been weaponized against the truth, deliberately blinding us to the realities of those pushed to the margins of our society. Recognizing this systemic ignorance is only the first step. True moral imagination requires far more than just the empathetic capacity to perceive what is wrong. It demands the inventive creativity to practically act upon it. This brings us to the mechanics of moral creativity, a concept deeply explored by philosophers like Iris Murdoch and Cora Diamond. The process begins with imaginative perception. This is the rare ability to reframe an event and truly see the complex hidden layers of a moral situation. Imagine you are in a corporate meeting and witness a colleague being subtly talked over or sidelined due to their background. Empathetic perception allows you to see the injustice and feel the sting of the unfairness. However, seeing the wrong does not automatically generate a solution. This reveals the perilous action gap. You possess the knowledge of what is wrong, but you are paralyzed because you are lacking the practical script to fix it without causing professional fallout. Empathy alone leaves you stranded on one side of this gap. To cross it, you must employ moral creativity. This is the inventive, concrete leap that bridges the gap, translating abstract perception into tangible intervention. It requires you to creatively imagine a socially intelligent way to interrupt the meeting, redirect the conversation back to your colleague, and dismantle the microaggression in real time. Moral creativity proves that ethics is not just about having a good heart or following a rigid set of rules. It is an active, imaginative design challenge, demanding that we constantly invent new scripts and behavioral pathways to manifest justice in our everyday lives. When society fails to exercise this moral creativity, especially during moments of extreme crisis, the results are devastating. In times of collective trauma and semantic void, such as the sudden outbreak of a global pandemic, the social imagination frequently regresses into paranoid blame narratives that stigmatize vulnerable minorities. We witnessed this acutely during the COVID-19 crisis. Faced with a catastrophic event that shattered our daily routines and created a terrifying void of meaning, public discourse fractured. The societal psyche was gripped by pathological memory, recalling historical tropes of disease and foreign invasion. This led directly to destructive plasticity, a concept articulated by philosopher Catherine Malabou. Normally, plasticity refers to the brain and society's ability to adapt and heal, but pathological plasticity attempts to fill the terrifying void of meaning by clinging to trauma and endlessly repeating the scapegoat imaginary. Instead of adapting collaboratively, the social imagination turns hostile. We saw the rapid stigmatization of Asian American communities globally, as well as marginalized groups like the Roma communities in Europe, who were baselessly framed as carriers of the virus. The collective imagination could not tolerate the randomness of a biological pathogen, so it actively constructed a human enemy to bear the blame. This is the dark side of our sociotechnical architecture. When the trauma is too great and the narrative void too deep, our shared imagination does not naturally gravitate toward empathy. Without deliberate intervention, it regresses into destructive plasticity, weaponizing fear and resurrecting archaic bigotries to restore a false sense of control over a chaotic world. If destructive plasticity is the societal collapse into scapegoating, how do we heal? Rebuilding societal trust after such profound trauma requires what Paul Ricoeur termed imaginative variations, the conscious construction of alternative narratives that embrace empathy and transform shock into active resilience. This healing process is mapped out in the framework of constructive plasticity and just narratives. The foundation of this pyramid begins with experiencing vulnerability. We must drop the defensive postures and openly acknowledge our shared biological and social fragility. Only by admitting that we are all susceptible to the same crises can we build solidarity. Building upon this base is imaginative empathy and narrative variation. Drawing on Ricoeur's philosophy, this involves actively exploring alternative storylines to break harmful cliches. Instead of accepting the media's blame narratives, we deliberately seek out and amplify the stories of the marginalized, replacing stereotypes with nuanced human realities. The pinnacle of this process is constructive plasticity and metamorphosis. This is where society successfully absorbs the shock of the trauma and fundamentally reorganizes its identity for the future. We don't just bounce back to the flawed pre pandemic normal, we evolve. Think of the grassroots mutual aid networks that blossomed during the lockdowns, where neighbors utilized social media not to spread fear, but to organize grocery deliveries for immunocompromised strangers. This is constructive plasticity in action. By choosing just narratives over paranoid ones, we leverage our collective imagination to weave a stronger, more resilient social fabric out of the very threads of our shared trauma. This ability to reshape our social reality brings us to the fundamental mechanics of language itself. Imagination operates powerfully through semantic clash. By abolishing the logical distance between entirely unrelated terms, metaphors construct entirely new truths, surpassing the real from within. To understand this, let us look at the anatomy of a metaphor. You begin with term A and term B, two concepts that logically have nothing to do with one another. When combined, they create what philosophers call predicative impertinence. This is the literal ruin of the phrase. For example, consider a newscaster saying, "The diplomatic peace process is on the ropes." Logically, this is absurd. A geopolitical negotiation is an abstract concept. It cannot physically lean against the ropes of a boxing ring. The literal meaning is entirely destroyed. But in that exact moment of destruction, the predicative impertinence generates the spark of imagination. Our minds instantly abolish the logical distance, fusing the fragility of the negotiations with the exhaustion and the imminent defeat of a battered boxer. The result is a new predicative meaning, a newly minted truth that perfectly captures the emergent reality of the situation. This proves that our language and our imagination are not merely passive mirrors reflecting the world as it is, they are generative engines. By crashing incompatible ideas together, the metaphorical process forces the human mind to construct new realities, proving that poetry and linguistic innovation are essential tools for expanding the boundaries of human comprehension and truth. While language provides a conceptual spark, our imaginings are also deeply anchored in the physical world. Imagination spans a continuous spectrum based on the materiality of its physical anchor, ranging from tangible paintings you can touch to entirely internal mental images. We can trace this spectrum to understand how the physical world dictates the imaginative experience. On the far left, we have physical pictorial images. This includes a canvas, oil paint, or printed photographs. Here, the analogon, the physical substrate, heavily dictates the image. When you stand in a museum looking at a classical landscape, the physical brushstrokes rigidly guide your imagination. You are bound by the artist's material choices. Moving to the center of the spectrum, we encounter performative acts. This involves a mime pulling an invisible rope, an actor wearing a theatrical mask, or even the psychological phenomenon of pareidolia, where you see a face in the clouds. In these cases, the body or the natural environment acts as a partial analogon. The physical cues are sparse, requiring your imagination to actively fill in the massive gaps to sustain the illusion. Finally, on the far right, we arrive at mental images. These include daydreams or the hypnagogic states right before you fall asleep. Here, the analogon has absolutely no external physical reality. It exists entirely within the private theater of your consciousness. By recognizing this spectrum, we see that imagination is not a single, isolated function. It is a sliding scale of collaboration between the raw, physical matter of the external world and the boundless synthesizing power of the human mind. This tension between the material world and human creativity is vividly illustrated in the historical relationship between poetry and technology. What we see is a grand dialectical movement evolving from primal integration through romantic segregation toward a modern synthesis of re-socialization. The thesis represents the ancient intertwining of the two. In pre-industrial societies, artisanal and agricultural tools functioned in perfect harmony with song. The rhythm of the loom or the swing of the scythe was inherently tied to the meter of poetry. Technology and art were physically and culturally unified. Then came the antithesis, bourgeois segregation. With the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, massive, deafening machinery alienated the artist. Poetry fled from the factory floor to the quiet parlor, giving rise to the ideology of art for art's sake. The Romantic poets rejected the smog and the steam engines, retreating into an isolated, hyper-individualistic flight from technological reality. However, we are now entering the synthesis, the negation of the negation. Today, contemporary poetry is directly confronting and utilizing technological reality to actively re-socialize art. Think of modern Instapoets or spoken word artists using digital platforms to broadcast voices about climate change and social justice to millions globally. They are not hiding from technology. They are leveraging the digital algorithm as their new printing press. By embracing the very tools that once alienated them, modern creators are forging a new, synthesized reality where poetic imagination and high tech infrastructure are once again powerfully and necessarily intertwined. This modern intertwining, however, requires extreme critical vigilance, particularly when we look at the robotics industry. As corporate media aggressively proliferates deceptive where-to imaginaries of humanoid robots, we must embrace Socratic ignorance to successfully separate technological fantasy from reality. Let us break down how our perception is manipulated. First, we have the fantasy imaginary, our deep-seated cultural myths of sentient golems and sci-fi androids. Second, we have the realist imaginary, the actual mundane truth of motors, cables, and code in a laboratory. The danger arises when corporate projections deliberately merge the two, creating where-to imaginaries. When you see a sleek, talking humanoid robot on a viral video, the corporate marketing is designed to make you believe the fantasy has become a reality. To combat this deception, we must employ Socratic ignorance, the profound philosophical stance of actively acknowledging what we do not know. Instead of passively accepting the viral video, we must pause and question the illusion. This deliberate stepping back leads to critical post-phenomenological awareness. Through this critical lens, the illusion evaporates. We stop viewing these robots as autonomous, sentient beings with consciousness and correctly understand them as highly sophisticated scripts, remote controlled puppets, and the mechanical tools designed to sell a product. In an era where artificial intelligence and robotics are constantly overhyped to secure venture capital, practicing Socratic ignorance is not a sign of intellectual weakness. It is a vital defensive mechanism to protect our societal imagination from corporate manipulation. Ultimately, we must recognize that imagination is not a passive dream. It is an inactive, heedful, bodily interaction with the world, constantly co-shaped by the tools we create and the social realities we inhabit. We can synthesize this profound understanding by looking at the inactive and embedded horizon. This horizon unites Gilbert Ryle's concept of heedful physical action, Jean-Paul Sartre's phenomenology of consciousness, and Pierre Bourdieu's pragmatism of social habitus. It proves that imagination requires three interdependent pillars. First, technological layers. Our imagination is now a distributed co-creation with computational tools and algorithmic networks. Second, social plasticity. Our ability to survive trauma relies on constructive narrative variation and the imaginative generation of empathy. Third, metaphorical meaning. Our capacity to surpass the real from within, using semantic clash to forge new linguistic and conceptual truths. When you bring these pillars together, you achieve inactive imagination. You are not just thinking about the world. Your bodily movements, your social empathy, and your digital tools are actively collaborating to project and build the future. As we stand on the precipice of the AI era, understanding this architecture is no longer an abstract philosophical exercise. It is an urgent necessity for preserving our human agency. We must actively steer our distributed imagination, ensuring our technologies serve our shared humanity rather than the other way around. That concludes our exploration for today. Thank you for your time, and see you next time.